What's up, everybody? Welcome back to The Pulse. We're excited to share this three-part series about autistic involvement in research as a form of self-advocacy. We interviewed Dr. Fakhri Shafai, a neuroscientist and chief science officer at AIDE Canada. Dr. Shafai is a researcher and ally and has been working with people in the autism community for over 2 decades. A huge thank you to Dr. Shafai for lending us her time during her very busy schedule. This is part 1. So, what does autism research look like today compared to the past, considering the ways that research has changed over the years?
I would say probably the biggest change that we're seeing now is that research is not just done on children anymore. When you look at the earliest research studies in autism, they by and large were on children, maybe adolescents, but primarily infants and children, and they seemed mostly concerned with diagnosis. Like, what are we looking for in order to be able to diagnose? The biggest change, I think, or the biggest thing that caused the change would be the DSM-5 coming out in 2013. So DSM is the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders. And it is basically the book that all doctors use to say whether somebody has a particular disorder or not. So they include certain checklists, and anywhere from 10 to 20 years, you get a new edition. So the 2013 edition was the biggest change. It's the one that got rid of the term Asperger's and pervasive developmental disorder and all of those other types, quote unquote, types of autism that were in DSM-3, DSM-4. So what really happened was that it broadened the definition of autism. So before, we used to only say classical autism, and classical autism was basically people who had extremely minimal verbal skills, if any at all. The vast majority of them also had an intellectual disability. And unfortunately, when you look historically at the people with this diagnosis, they were often institutionalized. This was not a happy diagnosis that families were able to say, okay, now we know what's going on, here's what we do about it. Instead, back in the 70s and those earlier years, it was, oh, this is your diagnosis, there's nothing we can do, put them in an institution. So you have to think about it from that beginning standpoint. And then with every DSM, the definition got wider. So, okay, in DSM-4, Asperger's was in there suddenly. And so there were autistic people who also had high verbal abilities. And so that became the larger definition. And that's when they really started to do more studies with individuals themselves, as opposed to we're observing this individual as an infant or a child in DSM-4. Okay, we're asking somebody with Asperger's, how do you feel about this? Or what sort of, giving them questionnaires that they can answer about themselves and not just relying on parent reports, which was the big thing that was happening. And now with DSM-5, all of those other disorders are collapsed under this big umbrella called autism spectrum disorder. And I will say that it was a very contentious change when it came out. When they announced it in 2013, they did it at the International Society for Autism Research, or INSAR, which is the biggest autism research conference in the world. And the people who were behind this change for the DSM, they had a particular session at the conference. I was not at that one. I went the next year, but I had a friend who was there. And she told me it basically devolved into a yelling match. Yeah, it was apparently a very uncomfortable experience for everybody in the room, because people were getting up and they were saying, how dare you take Asperger's away from me? How dare you take my identity away from me? And the researchers who were behind this change, which again, this was many years in the making, and there were a lot of people who were involved in this, but the main researchers who were involved said, It's not that Asperger's doesn't exist. It's that we don't have any strong evidence for where PDD ends and Asperger's begins, and where classical autism, as they were still calling it at that point, begins. So we have no evidence. So that's why we're doing this umbrella term, because otherwise we just can't parse it out. And that's also when they started doing the levels 1, 2, and 3. So levels 1, 2, and 3 under social and communication differences, and where level 1 requires very little support and a level 3 requires an immense amount of support. And then they also did that same under the category for restricted and repetitive behaviors. Again, level 1 requiring very little support, level 3 requiring substantial support. So it's important to know this when you look at the research, because the research reflects these changes in the way we talk about autism. And so in 2013, when this change occurred, it caused a shift in the research. However, of course, it takes a couple years for that change to reflect in the actual publications, because scientists submit publications, a year or two, or it will take a year or two from the time they submit the publication before it's actually published. So starting in about 2015, that's when you'll see the shift in the research that will start using only autism spectrum disorder, will not discuss PDD, NOS, or Asperger's. And I think what I've noticed the most about this change is that because it's broadened the definition of autism so much, it's made it hard to compare results between studies. Because if you have, 100 people in your study that are under this autism spectrum disorder umbrella now, but only 30 of them would have been included in previous studies because they had Asperger's or sensory processing differences or whatever the other diagnosis people were given before. All of a sudden, you have such a broad definition that it makes it really hard to decide what you can pull, what results you are getting that are generalizable to all autistic people and not just a small subset that you happen to capture in your study. And I would say that's probably one of the biggest challenges now in the research world is, how do we compare these results? How do we know that the findings from this study are applying to autistic people in another country or autistic people with lower verbal abilities? And that's one of the biggest frustrations, I would say, as a researcher, because you can't say that I did this study on autistic adults with high verbal abilities and they filled out a self-report questionnaire. You can't say that those results are going to generalize to people with low verbal abilities who are unable to complete those sorts of self-report questionnaires. And I want to be very clear that just because somebody is non-speaking doesn't mean they don't understand, of course, and that they're unable to fill these sorts of questionnaires out. But if they're non-speaking and they have a profound intellectual disability, which 30% of people on the autism spectrum do, we can't claim that those results from those other studies apply to those people. They might, but we need evidence of that. And you can't get that evidence by using the exact same testing method, because if there's an intellectual disability, understanding what that question is asking you, even if somebody reads it out to you or explains it in different language, that's not going to work for every person with an intellectual disability. So I would say there's a lot of confusion in the autism research world right now about what we can say is true of all autistic people versus just a small subset of those who are able to do our testing, the testing we're asking of them.
Thank you. Good Lord, that was amazing.
A little bit more. I just needed a drink of water. So one second.
Yeah.
And in fact, when I was doing my own PhD research, this is what was going on. I could not include people in my particular study if they had an intellectual disability because of the types of tasks I was asking them to do. So part of my research was in psychophysics, which you don't need to know. I don't need to go into the details of what that means, but essentially it's looking at the thresholds of sensory differences.
Okay.
But some of those tasks were a little complicated. So for instance, I had like an expression morph where somebody would go where a face was morphed from happy to sad. And people
Oh.
had to say, at what point do you see sad? And the idea being, if you test this a number of times, you're able to see their threshold for sadness, and you compare their threshold for sadness to a neurotypical person's threshold for sadness. That's a semi-complicated task. I mean, it's only a 1 or 2 on the keyboard, but the concept itself is semi-complicated. So I did a whole PhD. I spent years on this, and I can't say that my research applies to people with intellectual disabilities because they could not complete my tasks. Ultimately, and I'm saying this about myself too, ultimately, it comes down to a failure on the researcher's part to design tasks that apply to everyone. And it's a really hard thing to do. I mean, obviously, I wasn't able to do it during my PhD. There are some new tools out that are super exciting and that I was able to use during my postdoc. I would say probably the most exciting tool is the advances that have been made in eye tracking. And maybe I'm saying that because I did a lot of eye tracking research and I think it's super interesting. But the beauty of some of these eye trackers is that they have become so advanced that you don't need the person to understand how to use the equipment. The equipment does it without them even being involved. So what do I mean by that? Original eye tracking machines were these huge, bulky things that were very uncomfortable. You had to keep your head in a chin rest. You couldn't look around, and like they were heavy, and sometimes you had to wear a helmet so that it could do the tilt. And the average autistic person with sensory processing challenges is going to do about 5 minutes of that and say, I'm out. I don't want to do
Yeah,
this
5.
anymore.
That's
Uh,
liberal.
say it again, sorry.
I said 5 is liberal.
Yeah, I was exaggerating. If it was an autistic child who was doing this in one of the old days, you'd get they might let you put it on and then they say, I'm out,
Yeah,
I'm done.
you're getting 5 seconds.
Yeah, exactly. So what's so cool about some of these newer tools is that you don't need to hook the person up to anything. The eye tracker I used, it's the Tobii, Tobii. I believe it was XJ3. Sorry, most people don't need to worry about that, but it's a very cool tool for those who are listening and in the market for a cool eye tracker. And
Nerd.
essentially what was great about it was that it looked like a sound bar that you would put like at the bottom of your TV, like a speaker, but it would stick to the monitor, and it had cameras that were measuring pupil diameter and where you're looking in the cameras. And if the person looks away, it pauses the experiment. So now all of a sudden we have a tool that does not require the typical level of involvement. And we can actually start getting results from people with intellectual differences. And this is a huge, exciting change. The other, and maybe again, I'm only saying this because I'm in the field and this was part of the research, but the other really exciting change in some of the equipment we use for our studies was the development of the EGI. So an EGI is very similar to an EEG, one of those caps that you put on your head and there's all these wires coming out and it's measuring brain waves. If you've never done one of those experiments, they are a sensory nightmare because you have to put this tight cap on and then they have to scratch through the holes of the cap to
Yeah.
get contact with your actual scalp. So there's like this little stick they use and they scratch, and I mean, it drove me nuts, and I am not autistic, and I was ready to pull the cap off. And then they put like this weird gel in there, and then they put the electrodes, and it takes a long time to set up. And then afterwards, if you don't wash your hair right away, all of a sudden that gel like dries and becomes clumps and it starts falling out of your hair and it looks like you have lice or something. So it's not a comfortable experience. So when you look at early EEG studies of autistic people, they were only the autistic people who could tolerate the caps. So again, you can't say that the results you're getting are generalizable to all autistic people because you only tested the small subset that could handle your equipment. The beauty of the EGI is that it actually is made with sponges instead of the typical electrodes. And so you soak the cap in the saline solution and then you literally just place it on the head. And you have to make sure the electrodes are connected and everything, but there's no scraping, there's no gel. It's a much more positive experience. And of course, there's people who still can't tolerate having a hat on their head and don't want to be part of this. I mean, it doesn't work for everyone, but it works for a whole lot more people than it used to. And so I would say the change in technology is really helping to bridge that gap that was caused by, we just widened this definition of autism to a lot more people.
That does it for this week's episode of The Pulse. Join us next time when we come back to our conversation with Dr. Shafai about getting involved in clinical research, where we highlight some of the gaps. As always, if you have questions or ideas for topics you'd like us to discuss, or if you'd like to be a guest on the show, send an email to voa@pacificautismfamily.com. We look forward to more of your great questions. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you next time.